So we focused on those immediate collocations, and we found that so far it looks like many of these particular words could fit. But let's talk a little bit more about immediate context. This is also known as collocations, or sometimes pronounced as collocations. First off, collocations are referring to the immediate connection between two or more words. So in other words, words that kind of directly work together. Now, they are not necessarily defined by their grammatical relationships, but you will notice that they are often grouped in these typical ways. Probably the most common is when you have an adjective describing a noun. Oftentimes, adjectives give us some particular quality about a noun that distinguishes it from different nouns. For example, if I said a red truck compared to a blue truck, obviously those would be two different ideas. So in a way, adjectives and nouns kind of seem to go together, but notice that sometimes some adjectives don't go together with certain nouns. So for example, if I said fire truck this time, most of us would usually think of the colors maybe red or yellow, but we probably wouldn't think of colors like black or blue. So that kind of gives us an idea too that collocations often are defined by logic as well. Now, there are other grammatical relationships here we see, subject and verb and object. So a lot of it does depend on what kind of makes sense together. Now, the question is, how are collocations defined? Well, some are just things that we have every day. And of course, this might depend on cultures. For example, here in the United States, when we generally think of bacon, we always associate the word eggs. So for example, this little expression, bacon and eggs, generally is something we think about. And oftentimes, we also think that collocations are in a certain order. So, for example, you would not say eggs and bacon. We generally would say bacon and eggs. Here's another one, black and white. Again, generally when we start with black and, most people would think of the word white to follow. Coffee, for example, here in the United States, many people think of cream and sugar going together. So perhaps you can think of some others that you've heard in everyday communication. These are just a few examples that we might use that are kind of defined by our culture. Some, on the other hand, are kind of defined by their context. So, for example, a lot of idiomatic expressions might be defined based on their particular use in culture or context. So, for example, saying that somebody's a really big deal. Notice we don't say a very large deal. An expression that you might see on packages that say satisfaction guaranteed. Again, the idea here is that these particular words seem to go together. And notice we don't use other words in their place. For example, we don't say satisfaction promised. So the idea here is that these two words kind of work together. Another idea, of course, are things like laptop or notebook computer. Again, a laptop computer, we often think of these two things as working together. So again, notice we don't necessarily think of anything else with laptop. Generally, we don't think of a laptop book, even though we put a book on our lap when we read. So again, a lot of these are defined by their culture, by context, but they seem to belong together. So, getting back to our immediate collocations for a moment, we have a number of religious edifices. So again, first off, let's make sure we understand what religious means. Again, religious is also describing the word edifice. Well, an edifice is a type of construction, a building, for example, or perhaps even a temple. So we know that we're looking at many religious temples or religious buildings that they're talking about. So again, those particular collocations might help us in figuring out the answer. However, if we noticed from the previous slide, the idea here is that many words could go in the blank there. So we may have to continue to look elsewhere for more information, elsewhere especially in the sentence. So as we continue to look at the context, one of the first things we can think about is we're talking about the idea of Teotihuacan at that time. Again, at that time, it had lots of these different things. So, for example, if they have this particular building or construction, would it necessarily be considered ancient at that time? Obviously, it would be ancient to us now because that civilization was a long time ago. But in this case, would it be ancient at that particular time? Well, that doesn't really seem to make sense if we do think about the context of the story. So that's probably one that we might want to eliminate in just a moment. So now we have our three choices: carefully planned, very large, and carefully protected. So in this case, we're probably going to have to keep looking a little bit further out to figure out the answer. So part of the idea now is to move slowly away from the immediate collocations to some of the other ideas in the sentence that might help reinforce the meaning of that missing word. And again, notice the word itself is still taken out of the context so that we can focus on the rest of the sentence. So, which ideas, as we're looking through the sentence, which ideas seem to stand out? Which ones seem, for example, to be repeated or perhaps even restated? Notice that we have a list of ideas here. Well, I noticed right away that we seem to have a list of things in terms of their size. If you notice, for example, we have over 2,000 apartment complexes. That seems like a lot. A large number of industrial workshops. So I noticed that these two particular ideas do tend to seem to be repeated a little bit. So perhaps it's possible that the word we're looking for is C, very large. That's a possibility. We also notice down here that they talk about a regular grid pattern of streets and buildings. So again, it's also possible that it could be something that's carefully planned. So once again, we have to kind of keep thinking about which words we're going to use. So B and D do seem possible, but do they really seem consistent with the rest of the context? So for example, we talked about B. B might be one we might want to keep, but D, carefully protected, doesn't necessarily seem to be supported by anything else in the text. Nothing else seems to be talking about being protected. So in this case, we might want to go ahead and eliminate D as well. B could be a question mark. But we did notice that two other ideas were being repeated, over 2,000 and a large number. So in this case, I think the answer we're looking for is going to be C. Massive, if we look in the dictionary, does mean something that is very large. So in this case, since these are talking about buildings, it's most likely, or construction sites, it most likely would make sense that C is going to be the answer. Now, that took quite a bit of work, but this is the thing we also need to think about. Often